and hit focus.
If you go to Jacob's hometown of Beersheba today, now we would read it Beersheba, but one of the things you learn very quickly when you go to Israel for the first time is nothing is pronounced the way you would pronounce it. So they would say Beersheba. Go to that city today, you'd find a big city, probably 200,000 people. And there are many outdoor marketplaces where you could buy things that they probably sold in biblical times: olive oil, lemons, and many other things, flatbreads, or Yankees t-shirts and plastic flip-flops. You would see a big indoor shopping mall and many restaurants that serve questionable pieces of meat, at least to our mind, but many delicious foods. And before it went bankrupt, there was a Toys R Us. The city is ringed by highways, and all along them you see signs warning you that the camels are going to cross here. The water is very scarce there. In fact, there's a long pipeline that brings water all the way from the Galilee down into the Negev desert. There's also desalinization that's happening with water from aquifer underneath the desert. So you will find olive trees and many other kinds of plants blooming in the desert. But in biblical times, when Jacob walked out of his hometown of Beersheba, he walked into the Negev desert. And there was nothing but Negev for miles and miles and miles. It's a huge desert. He'd been walking alone in this desert for, I don't know, was it 3 days, 4 days? And he was still only 50 miles into the 500 miles that he would be going away from his home. And make no mistake about it, Jacob left home in some kind of a hurry. You may recall that his father and mother, Isaac and Rebekah, told him to get out of town quickly because Jacob had stolen his brother Esau's birthright and blessing, and Esau was murderously mad. So he left very quickly by himself and ended up in the desert. And if he'd even been carrying a knapsack, then surely he would have used that as a rock. But that's all he had. And he was exhausted, and we could imagine terrified and very alone. He collapsed to the ground and was asleep before his head even hit the rock. And through his dream, Jacob discovers what some people might call a thin place on the earth. Now, Celtic and Scottish mystics identify something that they would call a thin place, where the divine seems somewhat closer and more accessible, where the veil that separates heaven from earth is somehow lifted, and one is able to get a glimpse of God, a glimpse of the glory of God. And to Jacob, this place of dreaming, this thin place, he says, is none other than the house of God. And this is the gate of heaven. I've been to some thin places. Stonehenge comes to mind, or Sedona, Arizona. There may be a certain quality of light that lends a sort of mystic atmosphere. Rocks seem to be involved in thin places often. If you go to these energy vortexes around Sedona, you'll find hundreds of little piles of stones left by previous visitors. Like Jacob, they mark the spot with these makeshift altars. Now, I love Sedona. Sedona to me is what I call a woo-woo place. It's a little far out there on the alternative spirituality scale for me, but whatever rocks your rock, you know. So Jacob, from the biblical account, does not seem to be a likely candidate for being taken in by the woo-woo energy of a certain random spot in the desert. But the dream that he has in that place, that certain place, changes his life. In that thin place, not only does God give Jacob the blessing that he gave to his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac, but God adds blessing upon blessing and gives Jacob an additional promise. He says, know that I'm with you and will keep you wherever you go. And I will bring you back to this land, and I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So for Jacob, not knowing where his next meal will come from, not knowing what his next life will be like, homeless, friendless, next to hopeless, that's a promise indeed. Excuse me. And why is that such an amazing promise, such a life-changing encounter? Even though Jacob sees the ladder to heaven with angels ascending and descending on it, Jacob does not have to go to heaven to find God. God speaks to him right where he is, earthbound, human that he is. And those who are tempted to think that the God of the Old Testament is a God of wrath and the New Testament God is one of mercy, well, just look at the grace and mercy that God shows to Jacob in this story at Bethel. I mean, hasn't Jacob broken 3 of the 10 commandments in the last couple days? Thou shalt not covet thy brother's birthright and blessing. Thou shalt not steal thy brother's birthright and blessing. That honor your father. But God does not add punishment. He does not add punishment to the punishment that Jacob is already enduring for his sins. God adds blessing upon blessing in this holy place. And it's God's final blessing to guard and be with Jacob wherever he goes that transcends the place. God is not present only in this thin place, but in every rocky place where Jacob will lay his head. In every step, every mile, every encounter, every wrong step, and every right one. Jacob builds God an altar at Bethel, but God does not reside there. God resides wherever Jacob goes. Jacob may still be guilty, despised, homeless, and hungry, but he's not alone. We've all been through some thin times and thin places, maybe this year in particular. It's a thin time when you come to a desert place, when the past is so very over that there's nowhere to go but on. And on equals the unknown. When you're only a 10th way to wherever you're going, to a foreign land where even your relatives seem like strangers. Hungry, bereft, far from home, far, far gone, holding on by the thinnest of hopes. Every place can be a thin place in times like that. Perhaps every place is a thin place then because God can come to us and we might even pay attention because all else is lost. God comes to us not summoning us to a divine court of justice, but inviting, pardoning, reassuring, adding blessing to blessing. And God, who travels with us, does not live in a house made of hands. This journeying God, this constant protector, this merciful and awesome God, this God makes our whole life a thin place, makes every certain place a window into the divine. God meets us every day in what may be the ultimate thin place, our beating, fragile, human, loved, and forgiven hearts. May it be so for each of us. Amen.